Hi, my name is Josh Rust, and thank you for your interest in my presentation. Thanks to the organizers for managing to keep this conference going despite COVID. Let me just note that I'm only briefly going to talk about the agent exclusion problem due to time constraints. I think Kirk Ludwig is correct. Institutions are not intentional agents. They quote, obviously do not constitute in any ordinary sense a thinking being, unquote. In his Notre Dame Philosophical Review of Ludwig's books, Michael Bratman concedes the argument. However, he raises the possibility of a more generic conception of agency that includes but is not limited to intentional agency. In this presentation, I flesh out a version of Bratman's suggestion. A biologist claims that a wasp digs a burrow for the purposes of laying her eggs. The claim is not that the wasp did so intentionally or deliberately, so it's natural to assume that the intentional idiom is what Kirk Ludwig calls a convenience of language. However, given that, quote, the notion of agency can itself be understood variously, unquote, the philosopher of biology, Samir Akasha, argues that the biologist is best construed at gesturing at a modality of agency which is weaker than full-blown intentional agency. In this way, it's possible to simultaneously deny that the wasp is a full-blown intentional agent and affirm what Carrie Figdor calls literalism when interpreting the agential predicates as used by biologists. If there are well-defined criteria by which non-human organisms count as non-intentional intelligent agents, then those same criteria might reveal a sense in which some institutions might also qualify as agents. I'll call such institutions, if they exist, autonomous institutions as opposed to the more ordinary heteronymous institutions. Akasha distinguishes three categories of agency. Minimal agency, as formulated by Fred Dretsky, is an entity or system that can sustain the distinction between doing something and having something done to it. Minimal agency is maximally inclusive or generic. Vacuum cleaners count as minimal agents. For this reason, this conception of agency fails to capture the, quote, real pattern in nature, unquote, biologists flag using agential and psychological idioms. Akasha stipulates that a category of intelligent agency, which is more inclusive than full-blown intentional agency but less inclusive than minimal agency, would be appropriate for organisms. So what are intentional agents? Akasha's core contention is that when biologists use agential terms, interests, goals, trying, to describe organisms, they presuppose that their subjects exhibit a unity of purpose. An organism satisfies the unity of purpose criterion, so counts as an intentional agent if, quote, we can treat the organism's various traits as instruments for achieving subgoals, finding food, keeping warm, producing gametes, mating, which contribute to the single overarching goal of enhancing the organism's fitness, unquote. Not all organisms satisfy the unity of purpose criterion. An ant infected by a liver fluke parasite fails to qualify as an agent for this reason. Such an ant uses its mandible to fix itself atop a blade of grass in the evening. This increases the chances of its being eaten by sheep, which completes the parasite's life cycle. Likewise for organisms with more systemic intragenomic conflicts. Don't machines and organs also exhibit a unity of purpose? Yes, but where artifacts and organs are unified around extrinsic purposes, organisms are unified around intrinsic purposes. An organism, quote, ultimately serves no other purpose than to maintain its own organization. This is Daniel Nicholson. Still, problems remain. So my thesis is that autonomous institutions, if they exist, are intelligent agents in the sense that they exhibit the intrinsic unity of purpose characteristic of most organisms. There's a number of concerns that we can state at this point, the third of which I'll stress throughout the rest of the presentation. First, we might worry about whether or not institutions reproduce. Fitness is typically analyzed in terms of differential reproductive success, but institutions don't sexually reproduce. Frederick Bouchard argues that fitness should rather be elaborated in terms of the more generic differential notion of differential persistence. Finally, or second, there's the agent exclusion problem, since autonomous institutions would be intelligent agents constituted by members who are themselves intentional agents. Any account of autonomous institutionality must ultimately face the question of how multi-level agential co-presence is possible. If agents are unified in purpose around their own fitness goals, for agential systems comprised of agents, or multi-agent agents, how could agency exist at one level without excluding the agency at another level? I think this is a really important problem, and I just can't address it here. Third, aren't extrinsic purposive systems also unified in purpose. Even if we identify systems that are sufficiently unified in purpose, Akasha's account doesn't help us distinguish systems unified around extrinsic purposes and those systems unified around intrinsic purposes. Both systems tend to persist, but only the latter are oriented towards persistence as such. For artifacts and organs, persistence is a byproduct of the fact that they're sufficiently unified to realize a function. So if intelligent agents and artifacts both tend to persist and tend to exhibit a unity of purpose, what are the observationally accessible characteristics uniquely indicative of intelligent agency? If we can identify these characteristics, then we might be able to better distinguish heteronymous from autonomous institutions. I think enactivism can help. Akasha's account of intelligent agency is understandably cast from the point of view of the evolutionary biologist observing these systems from without. Accordingly, Akasha tends to construe unity of purpose as a property that organisms have. Quote, the attribution of goals, purposes, and intentions to a subject only makes sense if the subject exhibits sufficient unity, unquote. But we shouldn't confine ourselves to the external point of view. The whole point of Akasha's investigation is to license an idiom which would literally ascribe agency to parts of the biological world. If then we take what Evan Thompson calls the, quote, autonomy perspective, unquote, wherein the enactivist attempts to reconstruct the point of view of these agents, the property of unity gets recast as an ongoing and meaningful process of unification. Quote, the perceptually guided action of the system must simply facilitate the continuing integrity of the system and or its lineage, unquote. There's two ways in which organisms continuously unify themselves. First, organisms are autopoietic systems in the sense that they aim against the global thermodynamic tendency towards entropic dissipation to maintain and produce their own structure by way of the constant intake of matter or energy from the environment. Thus, organisms self-unify by self-maintaining and self-producing their functionally differentiated parts, which variously and advantageously constrain matter and energy. Okay. There's an objection here. Are institutions really comparable to such metabolic systems? Is a really important objection, and I don't have time to address it. Second, most organisms are what Ezekiel D. Paulo calls adaptive autopoietic systems, in the sense that they periodically alter their interactions and even alter their capacity to interact with the environment in order to better realize their fitness goals. Adaptive autopoietic systems are intelligent agents. I'll just use those interchangeably. All right, the first of two features of adaptive autopoietic systems, that is intelligent agents, are first that such systems historically self-individuate themselves. There are two dimensions to a system's dynamical preferences which explain why a system reacts in one way rather than another. The first is the familiar perspective dimension, wherein the system self-maintains and adaptively reacts to maintain its viability. However, D. Paulo describes the second historical dimension, wherein viability-enhancing acts of self-unification are conditioned by previous responses and tendencies. Organisms historically self-individuate by adapting in ways that maintain points of continuity with previous responses to shocks and perturbations. Along these lines, Daniel Nicholson writes that, quote, it is not so much the nature of external stimuli as the organism's internal physiological state that determines its reactions and behaviors. And as an organism's current physiological state is a product of a sequence of past events that led to it, it follows that the history of an organism fundamentally shapes its behavior. And now, accordingly, Varela, Thompson, and Roche claim that, quote, the cognitive capacities of such adaptive autopoietic systems are inextricably linked to histories that are lived, much like paths that exist only as they're laid down in walking, unquote. The second feature, gen identity, supervenes on the first. Because responsive autopoietic systems historically self-individuate, the diachronic identity of such systems requires neither the retention of matter nor the retention of structure or form. Instead, for such systems X at time 1 and Y at time 2, X is gen identical with Y if X and Y are causally continuous by way of successive historically conditioned attempts at self-unification. So given this, what distinguishes heteronymous institutions from autonomous institutions? Okay? Ordinary heteronymous institutions distinguish members from non-members, and they confer synergistic benefits to the former. Cooperation is secured through self-limitation and coercive mechanisms, thus members are typically motivated to cooperate by appeal to what is in their long-term self-interest. Most, if not all, institutions confer synergistic benefits to their members. They are, in other words, extrinsically purposive social tools. Searle, for example, maintains that, quote, a common element that runs through all or nearly all institutions is that there are enabling structures that increase human power in many different ways, unquote. Francisco Wallace sharpens this point by suggesting that institutions are instruments that give us the power to resolve cooperation and coordination problems. In the institutional sphere, cooperation by self-limitation typically involves acceptance of rights and obligations in terms of which a status role is defined. Institutions also utilize coercive mechanisms to enforce a distribution of deontological powers, and every institution is circumscribed by a membership relation that sets out time index conditions for counting as a member and other relevant social statuses. So what distinguishes heteronymous institutions from autonomous institutions? Autonomous institutions, if they exist, are non-intentional intelligent agents. According to the enactivists, intelligent agents are not simply unified so much as a self-unifying process. And as we've seen, intelligent agents have what DiPaolo calls a historical dimension, in the sense that they historically self-individuate by adapting in ways that maintain points of continuity with their previous responses to perturbations. Two such systems, X and Y, are gen-identical if they historically self-individuate in this way. And since both heteronymous and autonomous institutions are unified in purpose and tend to persist, an additional observable criterion is needed to distinguish the class of autonomous institutions which are oriented towards their own persistence. There's two possibilities. The first is that autonomous institutions satisfy the gen-identity relation. The second is that autonomous institutions historically self-individuate. These are two different criteria by which we might distinguish heteronymous versus autonomous institutions. Let's look at the first. Okay. Since the identity conditions of autonomous institutions would be specified by a gen-identity relation, one way we might distinguish autonomous institution from heteronymous institutions is to begin with our intuitions about whether or not the gen-identity relation applies in a given institution. This is Sheldon Messenger's strategy, a sociologist who documented the transformation of the Townsend organization from a political interest group, X, time 1, whose efforts were made irrelevant by the passage of national U.S. Social Security in 1936 to both a sales and recreational organization, Y, at time 2. Messenger writes, quote, organizations are not necessarily dissolved by the abatement of forces initially conjoining to produce them. They may gain a certain degree of autonomy from their basis and continue to exist, unquote. Because we think that X and Y are stages of the same institution, the Townsend organization, Messenger concludes that the institution was ultimately oriented to the intrinsic purposive goal of, quote, maintaining the organizational structure as such, even at the loss of the organization's central mission, unquote. In our terms, gen-identical attributions support conclusions to the effect that a given institution is an autonomous institution. There's some problems with Messenger's strategy. While such intuitions about gen-identity are important clues, these intuitions are unreliable, and the gen-identity relation in any case supervenes on a system's capacity to historically self-individuate. So let's look at that basic capacity to historically self-individuate as a more desirable and reliable criterion by which we can distinguish heteronymous and autonomous institutions. Okay, so my key claim is this: members of an autonomous institution engage in a characteristic, quote-unquote, understandable pattern of reasons recognition not found in heteronymous institutions. This characteristic pattern of reasons recognition must explain how the institution as a whole historically self-individuates in a way that's characteristic of intelligent agency or adaptive autopoietic systems. I contend that in autonomous institutions, members begin to recognize a new pattern of reason recognition while remaining sensitive to enlightened self-interest. Political scientist Hugh Heclo refers to this appreciative system as institutional thinking. So here's two descriptions of institutional thinking. As a basic orientation towards life, institutional thinking understands itself to be in a position primarily of receiving rather than inventing or creating. The emphasis is not on thinking up things for yourself, but on thoughtfully taking delivery of and using what has been handed down to you, unquote. He also says that this does not mean that closing thought to any form of innovation. Quite the contrary, precisely because it regards itself as the legatee of something of great value, institutional thinking eagerly seeks to understand what has been received in light of new circumstances that are always intruding. Without appropriate adaptations, the legacy cannot be preserved, unquote. So my key thought is this. If historical self-individuation is a condition for intelligent agency, and if institutional thinking on the part of members enables the institution as a whole to historically self-individuate, then for institutions where this pattern of reasons recognition is sufficiently pervasive, these institutions qualify as intelligent agents, that is, autonomous institutions. I've argued that autonomous institutions are historically self-individuating, but I'm not confident that any autonomous institutions actually exist. However, I am confident, for the reasons I'll describe below, that if there are autonomous institutions that will not be found among the toy examples social ontologists typically and understandably use as the basis for their generalizations. Rather, autonomous institutions are found, if they can be found, among our most complex and long-standing institutions. I'll conclude by arguing that Ronald Dworkin's law of integrity is the most plausible candidate for an autonomous institution. This is because if Dworkin is correct, our modern political institutions have the following three characteristics. First, its members engage in institutional thinking, which is a kind of historically oriented pattern of reasons recognition. In doing so, the institution as a whole continuously unifies or conspires towards convergence in a way that is indicative of intelligent agency. By contrast, long-term self-interest is the pattern of reasons recognition characteristic of members of heteronymous institutions. Second, these self-unifying justificatory mechanisms imply that the temporal stages of the state are related by the gen-identity relation. Heteronymous institutions, by contrast, are defined by what they do. And finally, third, Dworkin thinks that these mechanisms imply, quote, a particularly deep personification of the community or state. Modern political orders would be intelligent agents if Dworkin's correct. By contrast, heteronymous institutions aren't intrinsically purposive agents, but extrinsically purposive social tools. As the second and third features supervene on the first, I'll focus on that first feature. As discussed above, institutional thinking is the characteristic pattern of reasons recognition of those that participate in autonomous institutions, and I claim that Dworkin's interpretivism is a fleshed out version of institutional thinking as applied to political institutions. Institutional thinking is conservative insofar as it remains responsive to the previous decisions of the institution. Yet, unlike traditionalism or antiquarianism, institutional thinking interprets the past in a way that promotes unification and integrity. This pattern of reasons recognition is exactly that which is exhibited by the authors in Dworkin's famous chain novel analogy. Sometimes it's necessary to abandon precedent or abandon a storyline in order to more perfectly realize what the institution or overall story always already was. As Hecklow puts it, legitimate innovation is meant to realize with greater skill and fidelity the larger potential of what the institution is, unquote. In this way, it's not just unity of purpose which is indicative of intelligent agency. Tools, including heteronymous institutions, exhibit that. Rather, the unity that matters is the ongoing unification or integration achieved in a way that's sensitive to the history of the system itself. For participants in heteronymous institutions, relevant considerations must ultimately touch upon ways in which the proposed change must improve the creation and distribution of synergistic benefits to members. This is the position occupied by legal theorists who worry that legal precedent could have no independent normative force apart from its being an expression of the good. Quote, what justifies adherence to a decision known to be wrong? Unquote. Even if it is only the members of a state that can think institutionally, it's precisely because this pattern of reasons recognition is unintelligible to those such as the legal realists or utilitarians who think that institutions can only be social tools that it plausibly represents a set of concerns that are properly attributable to the whole. Thus, actions motivated by institutional thinking, if sufficiently pervasive, connect the present state of the institution to its past and are indicative of intelligent agency. I only have 45 seconds, so I'll conclude with just one point. Do autonomous institutions exist? I'm not sure. I've described our political legal institutions as candidates for autonomous institutionality. If judges and other members of the legal community reason as Dworkin and Hecklow think they do, then the political legal community as a whole appears to qualify as an intelligent agent, and so an autonomous institution. However, legal reasoning is hardly exhausted by this distinctive pattern of reasons recognition, and I have not begun to address the degree to which this pattern must be present in order for an institution to qualify as an autonomous institution. My guess is that modern political institutions are borderline cases of institutional autonomy. Indeed, this may be why Dworkin describes the law's integrity as one among several conceptions of law, which might be taken to register a kind of doubt as to whether or not our legal system is sufficiently agential. Thank you.